And then I want to welcome Jared Duval to the stage, our Executive Director. Welcome, Jared.
Thank you, Cara. It is wonderful to see all of you. This is a great view, especially after the last couple of years. So if you don't mind indulging me, I actually just want to start by getting a photograph of all of you from up here. That's great. So this annual progress report, which I am about to go through at a high level, just pulling out some of the key highlights and takeaways. As you will see, this is a fairly in-depth 40-page report. So don't worry, I'm not going to go through everything in here, but I do encourage you to take the time with it, to carefully go through it. This is a whole year of work, certainly by Cara and I on staff and our former data manager, May Butler, but it's only possible, and a lot of that work comes from the support of the network. So before I even talk about what's in the report, I want to start with some really important thank yous. Thank you to the Agency of Natural Resources and the Department of Environmental Conservation for the data and collaboration you provide. Thank you to the Public Service Department, the Agency of Commerce and Community Development, VTrans. We also get and analyze data from federal data sources, including EIA and EPA. And then, of course, there are our utility partners, from Efficiency Vermont to some of our electric utilities, the UVM Transportation Research Center. This report is really a collective representation of the information, the kind of wisdom that is held across our network, and we could not do it if it weren't for the generosity and partnership of so many people, both on the data side, helping us think through how to present something. And, you know, this is also something I think it's really important to note that is always a work in progress. So if you see something in this report that raises a question for you, where you think, oh, could this be presented differently? Or what about this? This raises a question that isn't answered. Please give us that feedback. We are always trying to improve the clarity and the accessibility of this report so that it is a useful resource to you, our network members, to the state of Vermont, to the media, to the citizens of Vermont, because no matter where you stand on your preferences of a certain issue or path to take, hopefully the one thing that we can all agree on is that it is vitally important that we base our energy and climate conversations in Vermont on high quality and accurate data and information, and have fact-based, evidence-based conversations about where we go as a state. So this is our contribution to that effort. I also want to say that every graphic you will see in my slides today is available for you to download on our website at eanvt.org. So if you're with an energy committee, if you're with an organization that has an email newsletter, if you work for a state agency and often are putting together presentations or reports, this is yours. This is an open source set of resources that we produce for you. Of course, we like attribution that this came from EAN, but we encourage you to use them freely and often. And the last thing I will say is that if there is information in this report and in the presentation I'm about to give that is of interest, you think, to the organization or business or university or department you work for, and you want to host a conversation, we're going to be scheduling those throughout the fall, winter, and spring. So please reach out to me about that. I think we've already got presentations and discussions in the works with Efficiency Vermont and with VSECU, and we'd love to schedule more of those. And then finally, back at the EAN office, we have stacks of these physical reports, and we print them because even in this day and age, where so many things are online, what we always hear in surveys from you is that it is actually very helpful to have a physical copy that you can have available for reference, that you can highlight, that you can mark up in the margins. So if you are ever hosting an event, and you would like to give out copies, we printed a whole bunch extra and are happy to give them to you. We've got about 2 boxes here today, so feel free to take them today if we run out, or in the future you want them, we can always get those provided to you as long as we get enough advance notice. So with that introduction, let me dive in. I want to share some of the key takeaways that come out of this year's report. The first, as you all know, with the passage of the Global Warming Solutions Act in 2020, Vermont now has legally binding greenhouse gas emissions reduction requirements. They are not goals, and if you look at the statute, it explicitly strikes out the word goals and makes it clear that these are legally binding requirements that we shall meet. The second is that even though they are legally binding requirements, we are not yet on track to meet those requirements for 2030. And the primary reason for that is that as a state, we have not passed the policies that could give us confidence that we would be on track. The modeling that has been done by the Energy Action Network, by contractors hired by the state, shows that business as usual, some incentives here, a regulation there, it is not going to be enough to add up to meet these requirements unless we pass policies that give market clarity and give us confidence that we can get on track. But this is not just about emissions reduction requirements. It's legally binding and as much of a moral imperative as we may consider them to be. This is also about what it can mean for Vermont consumers and the Vermont economy. So we share in the report the data that did not come from EAN. It was actually an independent study that was done by Cadmus and the Energy Futures Group, looking at an assessment of the state's climate action plan, and said, if we took all of the emissions reduction actions that are called for and outlined in the climate action plan, what would the net effect of that economically be for Vermont? And that analysis was done out to 2050, and what it found was a $6.4 billion in net savings and avoided damages by 2050. And we're going to get to a slide that shows that in a little bit more detail right now. And whether we talk about the largest cause of our emissions or the largest cause of high-cost fossil fuels, it is in the transportation and thermal sectors where the bulk of the problem is. It's 3/4 of our climate pollution from those sectors, as you all who've been with the network for a while know very well, and that is also where the vast majority of cost in our energy system is how we get around and how we heat our homes and buildings. So this graph has been updated as well, and it really, I think this is, every time I look at this, I can notice something new. There's so much valuable information here. What we do is we break down these colors are the sectors, so we can see historically and up to the latest data where our emissions are coming from. This comes from the Department of Environmental Conservation's greenhouse gas emissions inventory done for the state. And it helpfully shows what the requirements for 2025, 2030, and 2050 will need to be. But this is, it's worth remembering, while it may be possible to meet 2025, the amount of reductions required for 2030 are far more significant than 2025. And these, it should be always remembered, are not arbitrary. The basis for these comes from doing our part in terms of what the international scientific community has said is a scientific imperative for cutting in half emissions by 2030 to avoid the worst consequences of a destabilized climate. So this, I apologize that you can't see it. If you have a physical copy with you, this is on page 5 of the report. And what this breaks down is where that $6.4 billion net savings and avoided damages figure comes from. I think all too often, and we hear this in political debates often as well, folks often just want to focus on the cost of the transition and not the cost of the status quo and continued dependence on high cost and price volatile fossil fuels. And so the biggest slug of the modeling of economic impact of meeting our emissions reduction requirements is this big part of the graph here, which represents avoided fuel consumption. This is mostly avoided fossil fuel consumption when we reduce our dependence on gasoline and diesel and fuel oil and propane and fossil gas. That's where the bulk of those savings come from. Are there investments that need to be made up front? Sorry, the pointer seems to have stopped working. Oh, no, there we go. Are there investments that we will have to make in our transmission and distribution system, in EV chargers and public transit, et cetera? Yes, but those the modeling shows more than result in savings and avoided damages if we make them. So that is really important context. The question, I think, can come up, well, how can you achieve that amount of savings? And it's worth remembering how different fossil fuels are as compared to electricity in the marketplace. These are global commodities that are traditionally, on average, very high cost and very volatile. These were the latest numbers as of the time we went to press. You know, gasoline numbers have gone down a bit towards $4 a gallon. But the point isn't where it is at any one point in time. This volatility is a feature, not a bug, when we take our viewpoint out of the history of fossil fuel prices. And what we see in comparison with electricity prices, certainly in Vermont, this is that they are generally much lower cost and more price stable. And, you know, it's not just the average cost, but oftentimes there are programs that bring that even lower. So, you know, these are the EV off-peak charging rates that, for instance, Green Mountain Power and Burlington Electric Department offer. And it's the same story on the heating fuels side as well. I mean, if we look at the volatility in propane, fuel oil, especially, as compared to relatively low-cost, price-stable heat pump options. We're talking efficient use of electricity, not inefficient use of resistance electric, which you see up here. But this, moving from these roller coaster curves and those high costs to these more price-stable, lower-cost curves, is where so much of those savings can come from, benefiting consumers, not just in terms of lowering energy bills, but also in terms of what it means for the Vermont economy. Because we know 100% of the fossil fuel that we use in Vermont is imported. And on average, it depends on, you know, which fossil fuel it is and what the price is. You know, different shares will stay in or leave the state. But on average, about 75 cents of every dollar that we spend on fossil fuel drains out of the state economy. And this number, it's worth noting, is going to be a lot bigger when we get the updated data for 2022, because prices have been so much higher. We're talking in the billions of dollars of drain outflow of the Vermont economy that could otherwise be invested and recirculating here in Vermont with local jobs. Another important thing that is in the report is this graph, which shows a comparison. Historically, when we set tax policy, the rationale is usually, at least one of the factors is, you tax what you want less of, and in Vermont, we're doing the reverse. We have the highest taxes and fees on our cleanest energy source of electricity, and we have the lowest taxes and fees on the most polluting and harmful energy sources, which are the fossil fuels. So here you see how much more polluting those fossil fuels are as compared to Vermont's electricity portfolio, but here you see the taxes and fees that are put on those different sources. So this shows this is a summary of the pathways that the Climate Council put together with modeling support from the Energy Futures Group and CADMIS and originally EAN. And what this shows is where the biggest emissions reductions will come from, are modeled to come from in terms of the opportunity, what is known and available in the market by 2025 and 2030. And you can see that no one of these things gets us there on its own, right? There is no one silver bullet solution. We're going to need all of these. It is going to be vehicle electrification. It is going to be more efficient fossil vehicles, whether they're hybrids or hybrids, heat pumps, home weatherization, heat pump water heaters. There is a whole list of things that need to add up. But the challenge is, what we did this year is we added these purple lines to show where we have been and what the business as usual projections are. So again, the modeling shows that we have to get to the top of these bars here to meet the 2030 requirements. Or if we don't, we have to make that up somewhere else. And there aren't a lot of other known options besides what was looked at in those pathways. But these purple bars show that what is baked into the system right now in terms of business as usual, this also accounted for the increased budget investments that were made in the last legislative session and signed by the governor. You can see some of those. The increased money for weatherization brings this purple bar to this little gray bar. That's a big jump. That is important. That is not insignificant, but it does not get us to here. You can see the extra money that was allocated for heat pump water heaters to change out fossil water heaters. That does move this purple line up a bit to this gray line, but not as much as where we need to go. The biggest single change that would really ramp up one of these pathways is the Advanced Clean Cars 2 rulemaking underway right now, which would require a ramping up of zero-emission vehicles provided to Vermont by auto manufacturers, culminating in all new vehicles registered in Vermont by 2025 being required to be zero emissions. And so that regulation does not help a ton for 2025 because it wouldn't go into place until the 2026 model year. But you can see what an incredible and hugely important effect it would have in terms of being able to meet our vehicle electrification goals by 2030 and then even more beyond, especially by 2035. So that has been the biggest single policy or regulatory strategy that has actually moved forward, or that is moving forward. It is not done, and if I encourage folks, there's still one more public hearing on that tomorrow. There's an online webinar. You can find out about it online. I see Jane is here. Jane, you can raise your hand if people want to catch you and talk about, and Megan's here. But, a big reason that a lot of these purple lines are not higher than where they are, especially for these orange pathways in the thermal sector, is that we have failed to pass the key policies that could actually move them up with clarity and confidence. The largest single emissions reduction strategy in the Climate Action Plan was the Clean Heat Standard. And until and unless that and other policies like it are passed, my worry is that each year we'll be producing a report that just shows how behind and off track we are. And that does not have to be our where we end up. I have a few more slides. I'm going to go through them really quickly because I think the most important part is your questions and the conversation. I'm actually going to open up Slido to see how many are coming in. This is a good natural point for me to remind people that if anything I have said has sparked a question for you, or if you received your advanced copy of the report in the mail or read our press release, if you have any questions, please type them in. If you don't want to type your own question, you can look at what other people are writing in and upvote it if you want to see that addressed. But there's also great data in the report around energy use. I think one of the really interesting things is that we often talk about how transportation is our largest polluting sector when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions. But we actually use more energy in our thermal sector. One of the big differences between the sectors is how fossil intensive they are. Sorry, clicker's not working again. Cara, are you able to? Thank you. Cara always saves me. So these pies are scaled by the amount of energy use in Vermont. So you can see thermal energy use in Vermont is almost 60 trillion BTUs, British thermal units, which is larger than the transportation sector. However, our transportation sector is 95% dependent on fossil fuel right now, whereas our thermal sector is about 75% dependent on fossil fuel. And our electricity sector, no matter how you measure it, whether it's pre-rec, post-rec, it is less than 5% fossil in Vermont. So the amazing opportunity we have is to utilize this cleanest in the nation, no matter how you measure it, including life cycle emissions, including point source emissions, cleanest in the nation electricity portfolio to bring down the emissions in these sectors. We also added for the first time, I just want to point out a couple of the new things in the report. You know, if you think of this slide showing you the big picture of statewide emissions sector by sector, we wanted you to be able to zoom in and look at just one of these slices. And where, you know, so this just shows you transportation emissions, but there's a lot more detail that is provided in the greenhouse gas inventory about what makes up those transportation emissions. So we zoom in and you can see, well, here is thermal, but you can see how much comes from oil, propane, and other petroleum, how much comes from fossil gas over time. Here, how much comes from motor gasoline, how much comes from diesel, and how much comes from jet fuel and aviation gasoline in the purple. So we wanted to be able to have a little bit more of a detailed view into those things. I want to give a shout out to, I'm going to do a lot of these today, but especially to our senior fellow and former board chair, Lee Seddon, who helped us with this analysis. This started with an International Council on Clean Transportation report because there are really fair and legitimate questions about not just, you know, the tailpipe emissions of a vehicle, whether electric or fossil, but what are the life cycle emissions? And so this is the latest, most comprehensive report that looks at the life cycle emissions of internal combustion engine vehicles versus what their report showed was the U.S. average, using the average U.S. electricity portfolio emissions. What Lee did for us was to take the average emissions from Vermont's electricity portfolio to show the life cycle emissions of an EV driven in Vermont, which is, you know, 5 times lower on a life cycle basis than a fossil vehicle, and will continue to get lower over time as the requirements of the Renewable Energy Standard and other policies continue to drive carbon emissions out of the electricity sector. There's also, I don't want to spend too much time, I'm looking at the time, there's a lot of great questions right now. You know, one of the things that we try not to do is put our finger on the scale. People will say, well, I want to understand how this is in this view, and I want to understand how it's in this view. And so even though state law and state approach is to look at post-rec accounting of our electricity portfolio, if people want to see pre-rec in and out-of-state generation and purchases, we provide that graph as well. But again, no matter how you look at it, pre-rec accounting, post-rec accounting, the fossil portion of our electricity sector is less than 5% of the total portfolio. I think the last slide I want to share is this one, which I want to thank Velco for helping with, because a big question comes around if we do so much to electrify our vehicle fleet, home heating, home water heating, then what does that mean for the grid? What does it mean for electric loads? And I think that there's 2 things that are really important here. One is showing, thanks to the incredible work of our efficiency utilities and all Vermonters taking advantage of a lot of those programs and incentives, how much our peak load has declined over time, and the additional headroom that creates in the system for greater use of our, relatively low carbon electricity portfolio. And also, a lot of the concern is around heat pumps, especially in winter adding to load. And one of the things that they provided to us for the first time, this is the first time this is in the report, is distinguishing between what the average summer peak load capacity estimate is versus the winter peak load capacity because of the temperature differential and what that means for the transmission and distribution system. So, you know, there are quotes directly from Velco in the report that look at the ability of our transmission and distribution system to handle the projected increase in load through 2030 and what can be done beyond that to make sure that we are ready to move to a more electric and renewable future. So the top vote-getting question right now is, what is the cost if we do nothing versus the savings of $6.4 billion by 2050? I think that it's a really important question, both economically and morally, and I think you can answer it in both of those ways, right? So there is the cost of continued fossil dependence on high cost and volatile fuels that are really difficult to model. But then there's also the cost of lost opportunity and what it means in terms of whether or not we do our part in a scientific and a legal imperative. I think that if we don't do what would lead to those savings, there are questions about the legal costs, which may not be insignificant. Hopefully we do not get to that point because we do the right thing and do what we need to do to actually comply, get on track, and achieve those savings. But I think that that's a great question that is somewhat addressed I would encourage people to look at the full Pathways 2.0 report that CADMIS and EFG produced for the Climate Council that is available on the climate change website through the Agency of Natural Resources, where you can dig into more of the details of some of those numbers and how they projected the kind of business as usual. But I get what I think is implied point that I very much agree with, that there are multiple ways to measure costs, and oftentimes doing so in dollars is incomplete and inadequate. The next question, why is electricity taxed so disproportionately to other sources? I think that this would be a really interesting question to ask others in the room. I would offer two hypotheses. One, as a sector that has had a history of more active regulation and oversight, it is much easier to levy taxes and fees on an electricity sector and utilities governed by the Public Utilities Commission and the Public Service Department than it is on what has historically, unfortunately, been a sector that has not had the same oversight, responsibility, and accountability in the less regulated fossil sector. And I think a lot of it is also, it comes down to political power and who speaks up and who has influence. And that's a question around citizenship. I would invite Rich to also say something about, here we've got.
Thanks, Jared. I think the slide that you showed probably included not just flat out taxes, but also performance requirements with respect to reducing emissions in those sectors. So the cost of energy efficiency programs, the cost of the renewable performance standard are included in those charts. And so I'll go back to your answer, and those things are possible because over the years, the legislature and the PUC and the utilities all cooperated, frankly, to advance efficiency and renewables.
Yes.
And the same thing has not happened in the fossil sector.
Can you speak to your new graph on full life cycle emissions of all fuels and why adoption of an apples-to-apples comparison is so essential for Vermont to embrace? Yeah, so this is not in the slides, but it is in the report. Let me find the page so we can all be there. This is covered on pages 16 and 17. I think one of the things that, I really want, we're going to include this in the next Total Energy News, the monthly newsletter that EAN puts out. Hopefully you're all on that. If you're not, you can sign up right on our website. But our senior fellow Lee Seddon has recently published a paper assessing the GHG emissions reduction benefits of beneficial electrification. And in that paper, Lee does, for the first time, I haven't seen it anywhere else, looking at what the emissions of our electricity portfolio is, not just at the point of generation, but looking at the pre-generation emissions. And when you do that, you can no longer, it is very fair and important to point out, you can no longer call hydro or nuclear carbon-free. There are pre-generation emissions associated with those resources. But when you add them in, what ends up happening is that it goes up a little bit, but Vermont's electricity sector emissions still end up 10 times lower emitting than the ISO New England grid as a whole. So maybe we go from 2% of Vermont's statewide emissions coming from electricity to 2.25%. So it is important to account for those if we want to have a full view or a life cycle view, but it's also important to keep those changes in context relative to other things, including that we cannot be selective in applying a life cycle analysis to one energy source. We need to do it for all of them. And of course, as the graph on the top of page 17 shows, there are significant pre-combustion emissions related to the finding and the refining and production and transportation of fossil fuels. So when we do that life cycle analysis, emissions for all of those energy sources go up. Some of them go up more than others. And this is a field, I will say, it is really important to acknowledge when there are limits to our kind of knowledge and understanding. There are new papers coming out about the ways to properly assess life cycle emissions all the time. And the best thing that we can do is use the latest available data, stay humble, stay open-minded, continue to look for new information. I'm really excited that the Vermont Climate Council, through the Agency of Natural Resources, is in the process of working with a contractor to, for the first time, develop a full and accurate assessment of the life cycle emissions related to Vermont's energy use. So that will give us yet more additional information. But I think one of the important things that we try to get across in the report is that there are different ways to understand emissions, whether it's life cycle emissions, whether it's production-based emissions, whether it's consumption-based inventories. And to me, the point isn't to say one is true and the others are false, but to understand what each one of them tells you and to be able to have a view into each of them. Question, what impact would the clean heat standard have on our pathway projections? So one of the most, I think, elegant design principles of the clean heat standard was that it was really one of the first policies in Vermont that was designed to directly reflect the legal requirements of the Global Warming Solutions Act. And so what it did was set the emissions reduction requirement for the thermal fuel sector in line with the Global Warming Solutions Act requirements. So the thermal sector, the residential, commercial, industrial fuel use sector is responsible for about 2/3, 34% of Vermont's statewide emissions. So the clean heat standard would have required 34% emissions reductions, 34% of the overall emissions reductions to come from that sector on the scale and pace noted for 2030 and 2050. So we can't say exactly how many heat pump water heaters, how many heat pumps, how many advanced wood heating systems, how many furnaces using B100 biodiesel rather than fuel oil that would result in. But we know that overall, what would be obligated of the fossil fuel importers is that the actions that they would take or that they would incentivize would altogether meet those emissions reduction requirements. It's hard to know exactly in that market how many of those would be met by those different technologies, how accurate were those projections about supply and availability, what share is going to come from different technologies. And of course, technology is always changing, but what it would have done is give us the clarity and confidence that we would achieve the emissions reduction requirements with a suite of options and give Vermonters the choice to say what works best for their homes and building heating options. Question, thank you, I just want to pause to thank you all for typing these questions in and upvoting them. There's so many good ones. How can data and reporting like this be made available at the town or regional scale? I will say we're kind of in an in-between place. EAN, with the support of many partners, from B-Light to Efficiency Vermont and our utilities and many more, built and have maintained the Vermont Community Energy Dashboard. That has been very difficult to continue to maintain at a town and regional level, often because the data sets just aren't available or take a very long time to come across. So we have basically said every town, every region can utilize the information here. So this is going to be our #1 priority. But we do have a tool there that we continue to update that is very important, called the Community Progress Maps. And it is thanks to especially Efficiency Vermont, but other data partners, where we're able to see town by town, region by region, how many homes have been comprehensively weatherized, how many EVs have been registered, how many heat pumps have been installed, and we can track that thanks to oftentimes the incentive data, both through Efficiency Vermont and the Tier 3 incentives through our electric utilities. So that is one place, but I think that the long-term answer to that is going to come from the measuring and assessing progress work that is legally required by the Global Warming Solutions Act of ANR to do. There's a process underway to do that. The Public Service Department, Claire McElveny, Claire is here, can raise her hand. She's been very involved in these conversations, and what we're going to need to get towards is more holistic and frequently updated data tracking for the state as a whole, which then hopefully towns and regions can benefit from as well. And I'm really excited that for the first time that's going to be something that our state is saying needs public dollars to invest in. We had received some foundation dollars, but philanthropy is not a long-term sustainable source of revenue for what really needs to be a public resource in the public domain of that data tracking from ANR and the Public Service Department. So we continue to collaborate with them and look forward to making more progress on that this year. But in the meantime, if anybody wants a tour of the community progress maps and how to access some of that data for your town and region, let me know. And if anybody is either interested or knows somebody who might be interested in being EAN's next data manager to help us work on that, we do have a job description up online. We're going to begin reviewing applications October 3rd, and would love to add a great person to our small but mighty staff team with Kara and I. So I'm seeing one. Are there other comparable organizations to EAN in other states that are documenting progress or lack thereof in their states? It's really interesting. Kara was talking about EAN's history and how we were formed as a collective impact network. That was actually inspired by a network that exists in the Midwest called REAMP. And the idea that they had was that, the same one that we have followed, which is you bring a diverse set, broad group of stakeholders together who give you expertise and experience from all these different sectors to come together to figure out, what are the most strategic and effective levers for real and durable change. And they then support that work by doing data tracking and analysis. So REAMP is one in the Midwest. Of course, there are nonprofits that will individually kind of track data in their states, think tanks, for instance, but few who really combine those two roles of providing a real foundation of data and information for everybody to use, but then also foster and the convening and bringing together of the network at the same time. Hopefully that model grows. I know I've heard it from a lot of people, especially in New Hampshire and Maine, that they would like the equivalent and would always be happy to explore or support others in exploring that, but that's a great question. Any analysis yet of the impacts of the recently passed Inflation Reduction Act? No, since it just happened and this actually was finished in the early summer. That will be really important to take account for. I think one of the things that's going to be so difficult about modeling the Inflation Reduction Act is that it makes incentives available, but it doesn't require, when we look at the incentives for electrification, for instance, so much of it will depend on the uptake of those, the utilization of those. And for that to happen, my sense is that it's not enough just to make the money available. You also have to invest in, but make sure that there are folks responsible for helping people take advantage of that. And I know we have entities across the state of Vermont that have incredible expertise and experience doing that, from our efficiency utilities to community action agencies to state agencies and departments. But I think that's going to be the real key, is not just how much. At the end of the day, at least for our Global Warming Solutions Act, the key metric is not how much money we spend or how much activity we undertake. It's how much we reduce emissions and how much we help people save money in doing that and lower energy burdens. And making money available is a key part of the puzzle, but on its own is not enough and is really difficult to model. So if folks have ideas on how we should do that going forward, please let us know. Cara and I were just talking the other day about hosting a network webinar to learn more about, I know Rev just did a great one on the Inflation Reduction Act implications, but it was primarily focused on folks who are in the, who are doing electricity generation, and not as much focused on the questions that I think a lot of Vermont organizations and utilities have, which is the uptake and use of the incentives that were made available for homeowners and businesses, not just for electricity production. The question at the top now is, can we rely on our electricity remaining low carbon when we add 2.4 terawatt hours of demand? How is Vermont ensuring that enough renewables will be built to meet this demand? This is a question where I would invite others to chime in on as well, but there's two thoughts I have about this. Again, this goes back, we were talking about elegant policy design of the Clean Heat Standard. I think that there's an element of elegant policy design with the Renewable Energy Standard, because when you look at those requirements for the RES, which you can see on page 30 of the report, those requirements are not, that we have to be a certain percent renewable for the existing amount of electricity purchases. It is, no matter what our amount of electricity use and purchases are, you have to meet those percentage requirements. So utilities know and are planning for the fact that as we have increased electricity demand, they will have to purchase additional renewable electricity sources to be in compliance with the RES that sets a percentage target for overall use and purchases, not just where we are now. So I think the short answer is yes, but how that will happen, I would defer to the folks who are doing more of that planning at our utilities. But at least in our, and there's a big question about the future of the Renewable Energy Standard, but at a baseline, where it is now, we know that at least that minimum percentage of renewable electricity will be part of our portfolio as required by law, no matter the total use. What are the consequences for not meeting the legal requirements? I'm assuming this means of the Global Warming Solutions Act. I'm not a lawyer. I don't have the legal expertise to answer that. What I will say is that as somebody who just reads, as a layperson's view and a climate counselor who reads the Global Warming Solutions Act, I see those as legally binding requirements. And my worry, and one of the reasons that we produce this report, is that we could be on a track to, if you look at the cause of action section of the Global Warming Solutions Act, it says that the cause of action can't come until after an emissions inventory shows that we have actually missed the requirements. So 2025 is the first requirement deadline. We may not have an inventory showing what those emissions figures were until 2027, years after. The challenge is that if we believe in the letter and the spirit of the law, once we know that, and then say a cause of action is brought in 2027 or 2028, there will not be enough time to put the policies and regulations in place that could get us on a different track to avoid not meeting the legal requirements for 2030. So to me, the question isn't just a legalistic one of like, when can a cause of action be taken? It's if we set these legal requirements because they're based on a scientific imperative, because we believe we have a moral responsibility and an economic opportunity in meeting them, then we need to plan to actually meet them, not always be 5 years behind. I have also heard, and I believe, that there are other legal options short of a cause of action after we have missed the requirements. If you look at the example from Massachusetts, for instance, they weren't taken to court after they missed the requirements. There was an analysis done of the plan showing it wouldn't add up, and so there was a court order for them to come into compliance so that they could get on track. To me, a law has little meaning if you can't make sure that you're actually planning to and taking actions to meet it proactively rather than just reactively. But I know that other people far smarter and with more legal experience and expertise than I have are going to be looking at that question. My personal feeling is I hope that it doesn't get to that. I would rather that we, and I say this as a member of the Climate Council, I would rather that we actually take the steps necessary to seize this opportunity, to meet the legal requirement, to meet the moral obligation, because all that the risk of legal action is that it creates more delay, more cost, more missed opportunity, and could lead to blunter ways of reducing emissions than we can utilize if we act proactively with well-crafted policies as recommended by the Council in the Climate Action Plan. So with that, that's the last question. I am looking forward to reading the rest of these and talking with folks throughout the day. Please come up. There's a lot of other people in this room that can answer these questions far better than I can.